Begin this session by envisioning yourself in the Lower East Side. You're walking around and you decide to go into a gallery, and this would be sometime in 2015. And you walk in, and the gallery floor is filled with rubble, stone, masonry, it seems like, with rebar shooting out kind of dangerously. You could hurt yourself if you're not careful how you walk. And it's filling the floor of the gallery, which is otherwise a white space. You also then can't help but notice that there are these beautiful parakeets that are in there with you. They're flying around with a lot of people in the gallery. If there are other people in the gallery with you, they're probably hanging up on the light fixtures all together. These beautiful, bright yellow, green, and blue sort of iridescent colors, and they may very well be chirping and making sounds. Then you walk past this space and you notice that there's a lower part of this gallery, basically a basement, which is also used to show work. And you go down the steps, and you can't go into the space, but you can look into the space from the bottom of the steps, and this is what you would see as part of this same show. The floor of the lower half of the gallery, of the basement here, would be flooded with water. There would be lily pads and various little objects here and there, and you may even start hearing croaking sounds of bullfrogs. They would be hard to see. They stayed out of sight for the most part, but they were there, and they created this really sort of amazing sound and amazing space with this red, dark, glowing light. And so you go back upstairs, and you're in Louis B. James Gallery, which is no longer there, and you're seeing a work by Martin Roth. And this work is called, "In July 2015, I shipped debris from the Syrian border to use as bird litter." And so you stop and you try to make sense of this work, and you think, well, what are some of the themes that I can bring out? Like, what is the artist trying to do here? I think maybe the most important thing to realize, and maybe you would talk to the artist, maybe he was there, maybe you talk to the gallery owner, and they would explain the work to you a little bit, because it's a bit opaque, it's a bit wonderful but strange, maybe slightly disturbing. You would realize the artist had gone to Syria and saw the devastation there, and decided to bring back some of the rubble. He didn't think bringing back actual rubble from Syria would have been a proper thing to do. So he got rubble from a neighboring country and rubble from the Lower East Side and construction sites in New York City, and used that to be a stand-in for the destruction in Syria of that time. And so what he was doing there, and one way he explained it, is he was thematizing the way in which certain things get to cross borders, and certain things do not get to cross borders. So he was able to ship debris out of a suitcase from international countries near war-torn areas, and yet from those same countries, people who were affected by the war, in this case the Syrian civil war, had difficulty crossing borders, had difficulty making claims for asylum, and became refugees. So already now we're seeing this work hooking onto our topic for this week, which is the idea of the refugee, and more specifically the climate refugee, which we're going to start to unpack and define as we keep moving forward. Then you would ask yourself, well, what are these wonderful animals doing here? You may be a bit creeped out by the amphibians on the lower floor. Some people have issues with frogs, but frogs are wonderful. And almost everybody loves parakeets, so you would probably find the parakeets to be sort of wondrous and enchanting as a presence in this gallery, in this otherwise sort of destroyed, sort of debris-like aesthetic of the gallery. It's almost as if the birds kind of compensate, or maybe you might actually think they symbolize a little bit of hope within within this destruction. Then you would also maybe find out that these parakeets were collaborators of this work. The artist sought them out. They're rescue parakeets, so a lot of times owners no longer can keep their parakeets or their parrots, and sometimes these parakeets and parrots outlive their owners, and so they become orphaned. They become refugees in their own sense, in their own way. They lose their home, and then they need safe passage. And so in this work, Martin Roth decided to work with these parakeets, rescue them, give them a temporary home as part of his exhibition, and then a key aspect of this work is that they ended up at a well-known bird sanctuary in upstate New York to live out the rest of their lives, hopefully in a happy, more or less natural setting altogether. The same goes for the bullfrogs. The bullfrogs were rescued from markets in the Lower East Side, from markets in Chinatown, from being used as food to then having a way station or a temporary sanctuary in the basement of this show, and then Roth ultimately released them in Central Park, hopefully living out a happy, fruitful life in the watery parts of our biggest park in this city. And so once you start thinking about that, then these animals become not surrogates or not analogs. They don't stand in really for human refugees. I don't think that's what Martin Roth was going after. That's somewhat problematic. But they do in some ways point towards, again, the idea of needing a home, needing safe passage, needing sanctuary, and being within a state, an existential state of being a refugee. And they not only sort of thematize this state, it's as if he works with them in order to then open onto the larger question of the human refugee crisis, which of course is never far from Syria, especially in 2015. But also the idea of he's pitting a charismatic animal versus a not so charismatic animal, conventionally speaking. So the parakeets are incredibly charismatic, and they're first of all they're kept as companion species. They're not used as food, and everybody delighted being around them, and it seems like a no-brainer for them to end up in a bird sanctuary, right? So there's something charismatic about the parakeets, which lends them to being successfully rehoused and cared for. The bullfrogs, on the other hand, because of what they are as creatures, they're less fortunate in this sense. One, they were destined, and this destiny was altered by the artist. They were destined to be killed and used as food, and they're not conventionally as charismatic, and probably most people wouldn't care so much what happens to them, and it maybe doesn't sound so fulfilling that they ended up finding sanctuary in Central Park. So it's as if Roth was pitting a charismatic animal versus a non-charismatic animal, and then forcing us to sort of question, well, what are these assumptions we have about lives that we deem to be more valuable, more beautiful, or more conventionally of an objects or subjects of care than non-charismatic animals that don't have the benefit of all these things, at least conventionally speaking. And so again, I don't think Roth was sort of making this one-to-one analogy with refugee and the situation of migrants around the world. But I think there's a way in which he thematizes the problematic, which is quite similar, which is that certain people, conventionally speaking, because of where they're from, maybe the religions they practice, maybe their ethnicities, maybe their skin pigmentation, their culture, whatever it might be. There are some, conventionally speaking, that are more privileged, have an easier time finding refuge and finding a new home or getting care or aid than others, right? So all this is really opening up towards our theme for today. And this seems like, at first, it seemed like an enigmatic, opaque work, all this rubble and rebar with parakeets and bullfrogs. But it's a really beautiful, poetic, but very bittersweet, and actually kind of melancholic work that opens up onto these larger themes through these fragile, lovely creatures that are part of the show, that open onto the question of the status of refugee. Now, before moving on from this work, we want to go one step further, because what we're focusing on today, and for this class, we're focusing on, broadly speaking, political ecology, right? So environmental questions come into every theme that we interrogate from week to week. We're talking about not just refugee in the broad sense, which would encompass quite a bit of many different statuses of refugees, but more specifically the climate refugee. And here too, this work opens onto this question of the climate refugee. And at first you think, well, I don't see how that could be the case. This seems to be very clearly about war, Syria, and safe passage. But actually, there are researchers who have looked into one of the causes for the Syrian civil war and for the conflict and for this mass migration that began, that really burgeoned in 2015, and behind it was severe drought. And when we're talking about drought in 2015, we can't help but think, and really can't help but know, it's almost a foregone conclusion now, that exceeding, prolonged, and exacerbated droughts around the world, but specifically in this case in Syria, global warming and climate change are part of the equation. They drive it. Okay, so that means that the Syrian civil war, the migrant crisis, and all this horrible destruction and displacement of peoples, and the natural world, mixed within this sort of toxic mix is climate change. Are these large questions of global warming? Which then means that the idea of climate refugee also inhabits this work, right? Because if the Syrian civil war and this mass migration was not only due, or shouldn't only be seen as a product of war, but that war hooks up and is in some ways conditioned by global warming and climate change, then the picture gets bigger. Then we start to see the picture from a vantage point of political ecology. So Roth's work opens up onto these interesting and thorny questions about what exactly we mean by refugee, and more specifically climate refugee. Because the term climate refugee it's being used now, but it's a challenging term, it's a difficult term, it's one that we want to problematize and sort of unpack and really try to understand. And the first way to do this then is to think, well, what is the running definition of refugee in the first place, right? And the most often quoted text on this is the definition from Article 1A of the 1951 Geneva Convention, which is still used today politically and legally for the term for the status of a refugee. And it reads as follows. A refugee is someone who has a, quote, well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality, and is unable, or, owing to such fear, is unwilling to return to it. And so you'll notice with this definition from 1951 of the Geneva Convention that the reasons, or the origins or the impetus for refugee status are limited to race, religion, nationality, and political opinion, right? Nowhere in this definition do you hear about natural disaster and displacement owing to life becoming unlivable because of of some sort of environmental factor. And you certainly don't hear anything about global warming and climate change as a form of displacement or engendering the status of refugee. And so in 1985, it was non-binding, but there was a paper that wanted to coin the term environmental refugee and incorporate that into international law, which this was in 1985, which I can quote it for you here real quickly. They said that environmental refugees are those people who have been forced to leave their traditional habitat temporarily or permanently because of a marked environmental disruption. So this term would be quite helpful to recognize the way in which people are increasingly displaced because of drought or because of rising waters due to global warming and climate change. But it's non-binding. It's not officially used as of yet. So the term climate refugee has this sort of nebulous existence. It's not really official, or at least it's not binding, right? So we need to keep that in mind. Beyond the legal terminology and this history of the legal definition of refugee, we also want to question the idea of the refugee, the climate refugee, as a concept, as a term. And Demos, in his book Decolonizing Nature, which we're reading this semester, he calls the climate refugee an intangible figure. And why does he say that climate refugee is an intangible figure? Well, he says because it's difficult to define strictly environmental causes and separate them from poverty, war, or any of the other multifarious factors that are coextensive with the effects of climate change. And so what he's saying here, and I think it was already reflected in Roth's work with the parakeets and the rubble in the gallery, is that it's hard for us to know what is the effect of war, what is the effect of poverty, and what is the effect of climate disturbance. Where does one begin and the other end? Are they enmeshed in such a way that we can't even separate them? That it's not even something that we can catalog. It's just one big mix that has these intangible and really multiplying outcomes and effects on the world and on the livelihood of now millions, hundreds of millions of people, right? So it's hard for us to sort of differentiate, well, this is a climate refugee, this is a political refugee, this is a refugee because of political ostracization or political persecution. It's hard for us to differentiate these terms. And it may very well be that basically almost any refugee today, because global warming and climate disturbance affects everybody and everywhere to certain degrees, it's as if every refugee could be described in part as being a climate refugee. Possibly, right? All this is to sort of underscore that it's a difficult term and one that we have to use. I think we have to use it, but I think we want to use it with caution. And then there's another question about this term, which is the tone and the association that comes up with the term climate refugee, and maybe refugee, just simply refugee. And that's this this idea, and I'll pose it as a question. Does this term climate refugee reduce migrant populations, so humans that are on the move, humans who have to displace themselves? Does this term reduce them to victimhood and to objects of humanitarian need and aid? We're kind of like passive, and they're dependent on wealthier nation states and non-governmental organizations and so on and so forth, rather than distilling them or presenting them as legitimate and active claimants against climate injustice, right? So is there something about the term climate refugee that automatically, like the default setting of the term, is one of victim and docility and passivity, rather than maybe what we should think about is that most people, most human communities that are being displaced are the ones that have really nothing to do with the factors of their displacement, which in the context of global warming has to do with emissions. They don't emit hardly anything. And so they have a legitimate claim against those developed nations like United States, Western Europe, China, Brazil, so on and so forth, that have been contributing to their displacement, right? And then this gets even trickier, because what if what we're finding out is that these developed nations are the ones that are coming in to aid these populations as victims through humanitarian aid? Then humanitarian aid, however necessary and good it might be part of this larger problem that it keeps to the side, or makes invisible the larger and more urgent dynamic that this is a situation of climate injustice, right? People who are being affected are not the ones who are contributing to the problem, but those that are coming in for help, for political help and humanitarian industry. Those are the nations that are creating climate disturbance and displacement, right? So here we're really problematizing and unpacking this term climate refugee, and we're already getting to some of the bigger issues that we're going to be talking about when we look at works of art that have to do with this theme. And before we get there, let's do one more sort of unpacking and problematizing of the term climate refugee. And I think this is probably of equal importance, and maybe more important. And I'll pose it as a question again. Does the term climate refugee leave out history? Is there something about this term that creates sort of this ahistorical figure, like someone who's just displaced and they're in need of aid? It doesn't seem to point towards the historical forces at play in the displacement. And so not only the history of emissions and climate change and global warming, but also the history of all sorts of other factors. And I'm just going to limit it to this one, though it's a huge one. What about the continuing reach and legacy of colonialism? Is there a way in which the legacy and history of colonialism, and here I'm speaking of Western colonialism, is there a way in which it's almost like there's like a natural outcome of the hundreds of years of colonialism has led to or facilitated a certain direction for climate crisis, disturbance, displacement, migration, and refugees, right? I think the answer is probably, it's a complicated one, but I think it's probably yes, and we would have to do a lot of work. But let me just throw out some possible ways we would think about this. Rather than thinking of climate refugee as someone that's just in the present and in need of urgent help, what if we think of a climate refugee as a product, as a symptom of a much longer history of European colonialism, and maybe not just European colonialism. Maybe there are non-Western forms of colonialism that also have grooved or tracked the way things are unfolding in present day. But for our purposes, let's leave it to Western colonial history, because that's the largest and the most consequential. So what if the global distribution of wealth and resources and the unequal ability to mitigate damages and adapt to climate change, what if that is a product of colonial history and the power balance and forces within colonial history? I think if one started working on this question, I think they would probably see that it would be a compelling way to go about it. And then we would start to think that, well, it's not surprising that former colonies have less wealth and less ability to either adapt or mitigate the damages from environmental disturbance. So there you're seeing a concrete way in which the legacy of colonialism may very well be facilitating current crises. What about past and current wars over territories and resources, especially fossil fuels, especially oil, but not just oil, mineral resources, mineral-rich countries in Africa, for instance? What if that is also in some ways informing the production of climate refugees? What about neocolonial business interests in former colonial states, especially of the extractivist kind, again, like oil and minerals? By neocolonial, we mean places in the world that are in a post-colonial situation, like they're no longer the colony of a Western nation, and yet because of the infrastructure that's left behind, especially the financial and trade and financial dealings, it's as if they're still under the sway of colonial interests. So we call this neo-colonial. So an example of this is the Congo, which is an independent state, but because its resources are so wildly coveted by multinational corporations, it's had a very difficult time not falling into civil war and not falling into poverty and incredible levels of social and economic inequality, which continue to be driven by multinational corporations, which are usually situated in former colonial powers, right? So this is what we mean by neo-colonial. What about international trade agreements that often favor so-called developed nations over those that are so-called developing, or debt restructuring and the continuing dependency of a former colony on a former colonizer? What about the fact that countries that are most imperiled by climate change, have the least power and have the least vocal political voices, the least loud political voices, especially at climate conferences? Isn't this also a result of the power imbalance and the legacy of colonialist dynamics? It's compelling to think that, yes, well, it must be, right? I can give you an example of trying to sort of counteract this. In 2009, then President Mohammed Nasheed was the president of Maldives. Maldives was an island nation that's on the front lines of global warming and rising waters. It might be the first nation, if things continue to go as badly as they do with emissions and rising waters, in some 50 years or something like that, it might be the first nation that's completely displaced. Like the whole nation will be a climate refugee. In order to try to create more visibility, in 2009, Mohammed Nasheed convened a meeting of his cabinet underwater. To sort of, this is almost in some ways, this is a political figure, but it's almost like an art project in many ways, like a performance art. In order for those that were convening in Copenhagen that year in 2009 on the climate crisis, hopefully that they would sort of take them into account, because again, they're at the front lines of this, and they have very little to do with the causes of global warming and rising waters, which is emissions. So this is a lot, what I've gone through, but it's very important to have this complex situation in mind, because we really want to see the big picture. We really want to see the political ecology of the climate refugee, and it's always more than simply people who are displaced, who need shelter, who need aid, right? We need to see the bigger structural, symptomatic picture of the situation. And so what role, we're not going to pivot, what role can art play? So I'm going to go through a few examples for you, many of which will be really fruitful and thought-provoking for our purposes. And the first is this well-known show that happened in 2016, 2017 at MoMA. And I remember seeing this show, and there was quite a bit of talk about this show. It was called Insecurities, Tracing Displacement and Shelter. And I'm going to show you a few works from this exhibition. And then I just want to say right up front that the few works I'm showing you are highly selective. There are a lot of different works. So if you want to see the totality of the show, go to MoMA, and look at the website, and look at all these different works, because I can't do it justice. But I'm going to bring out a few works which will help us think through these questions. And so the first is probably the most visible object in the exhibition and the most talked about, which was this structure. It's a design structure, a temporary shelter called Better Shelter, Sweden. It's an emergency temporary shelter that's actually used for refugee situations. This is from 2010. It's a collaboration between IKEA. We all know IKEA, the Swedish giant, and the UN. So it's a collaboration between IKEA and the UN. And so you walked into this show. There were artworks on the wall and on the floor, and I'm going to show you a couple of them. But really, this was the structure that called out at you, and you could go in. You could go into the shelter. You could walk through it and sort of try to live for a brief moment. What would it be like to be forced to take shelter in one of these? I don't know about you, but it doesn't seem all that hospitable. A generous reading would be something is better than nothing. Help and shelter is better than nothing. But it does seem to be like a not very livable situation. And according to the curator, Sean Anderson, this was one of the ambitions of this exhibition. He kept saying over and over that he's not trying to provide solutions, and he's critical of architects and designers who think that they're providing solutions. He says he's providing questions. And more often than not in this exhibition, the questions that he's posing seem to have a rhetorical quality, that they're kind of saying there's a problem here. These are not solutions, and the sort of the design architectural industry and humanitarian community that's presently very much needed and deployed around the world needs to rethink the way it does business and the way it provides help. So there's kind of there was a bit of a negative quality to this show. I say this because I don't want anyone to think that this curator and this show was sort of praising uncritically, wow, isn't it great that the IKEA and UN help people, right? That's not what this show was about. It was above all questioning how we understand providing shelter and what it means to be forced to take shelter and to take aid, right? And there are a number of things that come to mind here within history of people forced to take temporary shelter in conditions that are really not viable. And probably the most famous or the most notorious was in 2005 during Hurricane Katrina, where the U.S. government under George W. Bush was woefully unprepared for this natural disaster. And whether or not it was completely natural is another question that we should ask ourselves, because if a so-called natural disaster is driven by climate change and global warming, then it's no longer quote-unquote natural, right? Because it's partly anthropogenic, it's partly man-made. In any case, there was this horrible scene of people. Again, here we need to think of the political ecology as one of tied into race and class and affluence and the lack of resources. It was largely people living in poorer parts of Louisiana, often the black communities there, who were then forced. They had nowhere else to go, so they were kind of shipped and stuffed into the Superdome, this sports arena in New Orleans. And I don't remember exactly the statistics, but a few people died. Lots of elderly people got sick. It was just a terrible way of providing shelter, of providing refuge, right? So this was a concrete example of aid that actually didn't provide aid, right? It actually showed cruelty and lack of preparedness for such a disaster, right? And I want to bring in a fictional rendering of this too. It's a wonderful film called Parasite. It won the Academy Award a few years ago. I think it's the first international film to win an Academy, the Best Picture. I might be wrong about that, so don't take my word for it. But if you've never seen Parasite, I highly recommend seeing it. Directed by Bong Joon-ho. And if you have seen it, it's one of those films that really really is great to rewatch, because it's so finely constructed. It's so well made that you're going to start seeing things that you hadn't seen before. And so if you have seen it, I recommend watching it again and keeping water and climate change and warming in mind as like almost a central character of the film. And then the division between those who are affluent and those who are poor. And so this is the scene after the great deluge, after the flooding of the rains, where the family is forced to, with other poorer families, to sort of live and take refuge in a gym. So like Hurricane Katrina, like the Superdome, this is like almost a bureaucracy of not knowing where to put people in need, and sort of just putting them somewhere, and not being prepared. And so this film doesn't seem to be about global warming, but my theory is that actually one of the big drivers of the plot of the film is global warming and climate disaster. So rewatch it if you get a chance. And so what are some of the other works that were in this show? One was a photograph by Brendan Bannon called IFO 2, Dadaab Refugee Camp. This refugee camp is in Kenya. It was built in 1991 as a result of the war in Somalia. As of 2020, 2 years ago, more than 218,000 registered refugees and asylum seekers live there. And this is one of the most incredible things you'll learn about if you study about the history of refugees, is that the average duration of being a refugee, of being away from your home, is 26 years. So 26 years definitely does not feel like a temporary shelter. Whole communities and economies prop up and develop within these refugee camps around the world. And again, today there are hundreds of millions of refugee and asylum seekers around the world. And then I should also say that in 2010, there was the famine, the Horn of Africa famine, which a lot of people who had to save themselves and leave this famine went to Kenya and were put into these camps. And again, here then we have the question of, is this camp simply a result of the war in Somalia and other geopolitical conflicts, or is it also a result of climate change and famine and drought? I think we have to say that it's both, right, and that they're entangled. The work on the ground is by Tiffany Chung. It's called Finding One's Shadow in Ruins and Rubble from 2014. And then there are these light boxes, these images that are filled with light, so they glow on the ground, and they have wooden frames. They're these boxes. And each image shows a house, a structure that's been destroyed in Syria. Okay, so we get back to the Syrian civil war and the Syrian crisis through this work. So these works were right by that temporary shelter that we talked about a moment ago. And here's another image it was very large, a prominent work in the show by Rasmus Denbol. I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. It's called Europe's New Borders from 2015. And this is a photograph, an image of over 100,000 life vests and rubber boats that lie in a 10-meter high pile on the island of Lesbos in Greece. So Greece was at the epicenter, in many ways, of welcoming, or in some cases not welcoming, refugees and migrants. In 2015 alone, 800,000 refugees and migrants came on shore into Greece to try to seek refuge and asylum. So I've shown you a few works along with that structure, the better shelter structure. And so what you want to ask yourself is, well, what effect does this exhibition have? How does it inform the conversations we have about refugees? And so I'll just say a couple things real quickly, at least sort of my take on this, though everyone else will have different and maybe more subtle and deeper takes. Is that one, it definitely seems to emphasize victimhood, and it definitely seems to emphasize sort of a very negative understanding of being a refugee and of being a migrant. So human mobility is an ongoing thing. It has always been an ongoing thing. Certainly, we don't want to be optimistic about forced mobility, but maybe there's a way in which the discourse over refugee status and climate refugee can be one that opens up towards different or more optimistic horizons, right? Rather than simply showing destruction, detritus, unlivable conditions, and so on and so forth. The other thing is that you never really see, at least in the works I've shown you and a lot of the other works, there's not much of like the voice or the visibility of actual people who are part of this narrative. That's not always the case. Some of the works did show and lend voice and visibility to refugees, but for the most part, it had this negative aspect, and so. The other thing I want to bring in about this show before we move forward is that to prepare for this, I watched a talk between the curator, Sean Anderson, who was eloquent and spoke really nicely about his show and his ambitions for this show, and Glenn Laurie, who's the director of MoMA. And Laurie says two things during this talk which sort of struck me and took me aback. One, he said that he said this to the audience during the question and answer period. He advised to the audience, I think everyone should go visit a refugee camp because it's a poignant experience. And there were two things about this that I found to be unreflective. One, the idea that everybody has the means to go visit a migrant camp. He says they're more or less everywhere, but the idea that everyone would be able to do this seems a bit extravagant. But even more problematic to me is the idea that it kind of smacks of this sort of tourism of victimhood, where you would go and you would see these difficult living situations. You would see a camp. You would likely be horrified by it. It would maybe create a new consciousness in you, and so on and so forth. And yet you'd still, at the end of the day, be swooping in and out and just kind of experiencing it. And that's troubling to me. And I remember a story a few years ago in Davos. Every year, very wealthy people get together in Davos. And one of their activities was that they had recreated a refugee camp that they could go and visit, just to like get to experience what it's like to be a refugee for a brief moment. I see how this is, how this could be a poignant experience and consciousness raising, but it also smacks as a bit dubious and a bit problematic. Simply because it's almost like again kind of like a poverty tourism and a bit of wealthy the navel gazing of the wealthy. But maybe I'm being too critical here. I'd love to hear your thoughts. The other thing that Glenn Rowley said during this talk, which relates directly to what we're doing here, is that at some point an anonymous audience member, I don't know who asked this question during the Q&A period, but it's a wonderful question, and they asked about, well, okay, what about environmental disaster and climate change and displacement? And the answer that Sean Anderson, the curator, gave wasn't really that satisfactory, but Glenn Laurie's answer seemed downright wrong. He basically said that refugees from political persecution or from war or from ethnic conflict, usually they're not really welcomed, and that's definitely the case in Europe, especially with the rise of xenophobia and right-wing politics. But then he said something which again struck me as strange. He said, On the other hand, refugees that come from natural disasters are usually welcomed. And I thought this can't possibly be the case. And it also works with an understanding that refugee from war and a refugee from environmental displacement can be kept separate, which I think we've established that no, these things are enmeshed, they're mixed together, and they're hard to differentiate. So I found these comments by Glenn Loury to be problematic, especially within the context of this show, which sought to sort of be consciousness raising about the way refugees are sheltered, but did not really in any way include the larger question of political ecology, of environmental disturbance and climate change. So maybe what we want, or what we might think to be more effective as a tactic for art, are artists who give more positive, maybe not positive, but like more personal forms of storytelling in their works, in their installations. So one possible example that doesn't sort of leave the refugee out of the picture altogether might be Kader Attia, this work that he did called La Mer Morte, the Dead Sea, from 2016. And it's strewn on the floor. It's all these blue-colored shoes, jeans, and clothes, all of them secondhand, sort of littering the floor as if it's creating like a watery surface, but also unavoidably, you can't help but think of like individual people who are now gone, who are drowned, right? And here he's referencing the journeys, the perilous journeys that people have to make when they become refugees and when they try to claim asylum somewhere, right? So maybe there's a way in which this work points more towards the individual experience and starts to tell the story of the refugee themselves rather than the aesthetics of design and architecture and humanitarian aid. And a sole focus on on large scale destruction and sort of gathering up of human populations that are in migrant conditions. Going even further than this is Bushra Khalili's work called the Mapping Journey Project, which actually was up at MoMA at the same time, not part of the show, but at the same time as the Insecurities exhibition that we just talked about. And I find this to be a really compelling work. It's a number of videos, and they're playing at the same time. There's these are screens that are in the space, so they have two different works that are part of this series projected on either side. And you would sit down and put on the headphones, and you would listen to someone telling their story, talking about the journey that they had to make, and then drawing the journey with a pen on the map, right? So, and each one is a different story, different forms of refugee. Sometimes it's a refugee where they don't leave their country, but they're displaced within their country. They're forced to be displaced. So this is called internal displacement. So I find this to be much more personal, much more poetic, and one of her ambitions for this work is to take the map, which is such an objective and impersonal thing, and turn it into sort of a foundation for a personal story and for a subjective geography, what she calls a counter geography. And I also really love the fact that throughout history, especially colonialist history, it's incredible to think about all the ways in which very powerful people were able to simply draw the map of the places in the world that they'd colonized, and shape it according to their own will. And then the idea that if you draw a line on a map, the space of that line in real life is huge, right? Especially if it's a map of this scale. So it's not just this simple line. There's actually this incredible, the barrier that it creates is actually a very large piece of area that may very well not be the logical way to sort of organize that geographical space, right? So the way in which everyday people can come and sort of make their own marks on these pre-established lines that were made largely in Africa in the 19th century is a powerful one, right? And so this is an example of a work that would be more less focused on the victimization, but more on like this active ability to tell your story and to talk about the journey that you've taken, that certain refugees have taken. And Ai Weiwei's film Human Flow from 2017, it certainly fits that picture as well. It's long, but like over 2 hours long, but it's definitely worth a watch. Ai Weiwei is probably the most famous contemporary Chinese artist. He goes all over the place, all over the world, and documents and tries to sort of interact with, although he's not as present in the film as you might think. He doesn't make it about himself, which is really, I think, a wonderful tact that he took. He really tries to understand the lives and the communities that are based around these forms of shelter and these refugee camps around the world. And again, he goes everywhere. And so again, this is a type of work, in this case, a film that tries to personalize and tries to sort of understand the individual lives as best as one can of what it means to be in one of these camps. And so the other group of artists that does this kind of work, where they're really trying to, it's almost more journalistic, and in this case, the Argos Collective, they are a group of photographers and journalists who want to make visible the plight of those that are on the front lines of climate change, global warming, and environmental displacement. And so they go around the world. They've gone to the Maldives. In this series, this is at Tuvalu in the Pacific Ocean, another one of these small island nations that's imperiled by rising waters. And this is one of the series. This is by Laurent Weil. It's called Climate Refugees, Tuvalu. So this is one of the atolls of Tuvalu. That's called Funafuti Island. And he shows like the way in which he photographs these locations. He often, water and the imperilment of water is a key aspect of the work. Here he shows those that live there. They'll go out in the evenings into the water, and they'll talk. It's like a community. There's a community aspect to it. So he's showing sort of the everyday lives of these people that live there. He shows students that are there. They like to sing. So this is a classroom where they're singing, and behind them is instruction on the greenhouse effect and on global warming. So there's this wonderful connection that's being made here between the students, where they live in the world, and what they're currently doing in the classroom. And here is another image that shows this sort of cresting wave. It's from this like lower vantage point. It seems to be, like looming down on the atoll, on the island. And so, along with Ai Weiwei's work, the group of the collective Argos, the Argos Collective, focuses on individual stories, focuses on individual communities, and focuses often on the environmental situation that they find themselves in, but in a limited, localized way. And so this is where we get to Demos and the critique of the Argos Collective, and also the critique of Ai Weiwei. These are things that we're going to talk about when we get together. But what issue does Demos take here? What is his issue with these forms of work? I think, briefly put, however nice these works might make us feel, like we get to see personal narratives, we get to see the plight of people, not in this sort of objective, kind of cold way that the Insecurities exhibition did it, but in a warmer way, one where we're actually like, we get a glimpse into the human community that are on the front lines of climate change. What he finds problematic with this is that it leaves out the bigger picture, right? It leaves out the bigger picture. He's very much interested in doing a large-scale political ecology, what would be intersectional and structural. So don't just show these local communities, but pan out somehow and show the reasons and the symptoms and the drivers of their present condition, right? Which would lead us back to all those things we talked about at the beginning of class, which is the history of international trade agreements, the legacy of colonialism, fossil fuel industries, the disparities of wealth between developed and developing countries, humanitarian, the humanitarian aid as this industry, all these things. Like he argues that the Argos Collective and someone like Ai Weiwei is too myopic. Like they're just looking at these personal, local moments. They're leaving out the bigger picture, which is the picture we should probably be more preoccupied with, which is those that are to blame, right, for this predicament. He has another critique of this type of work, is that it doesn't show like alternative possibilities. Like there's a way in which he finds this work to be fatalistic. And by fatalistic, I mean like it's a foregone conclusion that they're going to be underwater in 50 years. There's nothing we can do about it, right? However daunting it might be, I think he's probably right about this, that we shouldn't say that this is a foregone conclusion. We need to be struggling, especially those in power that have a say in how our future goes. We should continually struggling so that this doesn't happen, so that it's not just fate and destiny, but actually we can change course so that it's no longer fate or destiny for these people and for hundreds and millions of other peoples around the world who are going to be affected if things go the same way, right? So this is Demos's critique of these works. And I'll just add, before we get to our final work, I'll just add, I want us to think, or I think there's something to his criticism, though I wonder if there isn't room for multiple approaches. Like I definitely wouldn't want a contemporary art world where this was the only type of work that was being made about climate refugees. Like I definitely want to see works that are larger and structural, intersectional. But that doesn't mean that maybe there isn't a place for works that allow others to tell their story. Like maybe the Argos Collective doesn't really allow these communities to really tell their stories. They're kind of the object of their camera. But a work like that I just showed you by Bushra Khalili, the Mapping Journey Project, that is a work that it's limited in its scope. It's not showing the larger structural issue, but it is allowing someone to tell their own story. And I think that part of the mix, or part of the arsenal of contemporary art, should be these more local, personal forms of allowing others to tell their stories, because I think that's important, alongside the larger structural type of works that tell the big picture and show the circumstances and the causes of these crises. And so there is a work that was in the exhibition that we talked about a moment ago, the Insecurities Tracing Displacement and Shelter exhibition. And this is a work that Demos does think gives us the big picture. It's called Liquid Traces, and it's produced by Forensic Oceanography, which is a part of Forensic Architecture, which is a really interesting collective that we're going to end up talking about later in other sessions. But what they do is they go about and they take information that's public, and they study it. By forensic, they really mean like detective work. Like they go and they try to recreate situations in order to expose what actually happened, right? So they do this with lots of different things. So they're an art collective, but think of them almost as like an art collective that does detective work to try to re-engineer an event in order to bring it to light. And so for this work called Liquid Traces, the longer title is Liquid Traces, Boat Left to Die, was about a boat that left Tunisia in 2011 They were trying to make it to Italy, and they ran out of gas in waters that are the most patrolled waters in the world, the Mediterranean Ocean, by NATO and by different countries. And they were seen on multiple occasions, both by military helicopters, other ships, even just fishermen. And this is sad, fishing boats, whenever they would help migrants trying to reach safety, they would often get into legal trouble. And so what happened over time is that fishing boats, when they saw migrants, they would just leave. They wouldn't take the risk, right? And so this boat was out there for, I think it was 11 days or something like this. And there were plenty of opportunities for them to be saved, but no one did. And so and a number of them died. Only a few, I think 9 out of a much larger number, ended up surviving this harrowing journey. They were there were a number of points where they could have been saved, but they weren't. And so it raises the interesting question of, can people be murdered or killed by inaction? Right, which is an interesting legal question. And there was very little known about this boat until these artists came and did this work of liquid traces, where they don't know for sure all the actors that were involved in this episode, but there is compelling evidence, so much so that this work has been used in international courts to try to figure out what happened and to try to see who might be culpable. So this is an example of a work that doesn't focus only on the individual refugees, but shows you the bigger picture of what it means to try to reach sanctuary, safe haven, and refuge and asylum, and all the impediments to this, which are very large scale, which have to do with political power, which has to do with nation states, like in Tunisia or in Libya, which was where they ended back up. That these places are in episodes of war. They're difficult places to go back to, which is why this area is patrolled by NATO. But then also on the other side of it, right? Because we shouldn't forget that Europe, especially beginning at this time, there were the rise of xenophobic and anti-migrant rhetoric and political parties, right? So these people who are trying to find refuge from this impossible situation are stuck between that impossible situation and then a Europe that has become unwelcoming. And this is sad because the very foundation of Europe is one of unconditional opening up to the other, to the migrant and to the refugee. And so there are some that argue that this turn in Europe against migrant populations and against providing asylum is actually sort of the loss or maybe even the death of the idea of Europe itself. So that's all to say that this work certainly opens onto some of the larger structural issues and the bigger picture of the idea of climate refugees. But I want to leave you with just this one question, because I think in preparing this lecture, I had difficulty finding works that I thought would actually fit with the criteria of what Demos would want as a successful work that would show the big picture of climate refugee, of war, of politics, of climate change, of environmental displacement, and so on and so forth, like the really large picture. And that may be that that there aren't works yet that have done this, that it's such a complex question that maybe artists haven't figured out exactly how to visualize or present or to work with this type of scale and the crisis on this type of scale. That it may be easier to talk or write about than situate within an artwork or an art project. So that will be interesting as the years go forward, and the idea of climate refugee and the crisis itself keeps getting more and more pitched, high pitched, and more visible. Hopefully artists will come along and make work that will allow us to think of a better future for climate refugees and environmental displacement.